welcome to everyone, both in person and online, to this session entitled How Can We Improve on Our Food Security? It's a session that's sponsored by two of Cambridge University's centres. One is the Cambridge Global Food Security Centre, and the second is the Centre for Resilience and Sustainable Development. And both of those centres bring together a cross-disciplinary group of people to tackle these big problems, and I'm delighted that we've got a cross-disciplinary group of speakers today to address and discuss this. And from closest to me, we have Dr. Emmeline Rood, who is a historian who has investigated how fish stocks have collapsed. We'll hear a bit about her work. We have Tim Lang, who's Emeritus Professor of Food Policy at City University, and Professor Lang has been a consultant to all of the major organizations involved in global food security, including the WHO, the FAO, the UN, and he's been a special advisor on the House of Commons Select Committees. So he's dealt with various folks on this front. And next to Tim is Anoop Tripathi, who's a Cambridge Gates scholar in the Department of Plant Sciences, who's been doing amazing things with very familiar food plants that we'll hear about. And David Rose, at the end, is Professor of Sustainable Agricultural Systems at Cranfield University, and he leads a research group that focuses on, in a sense, the reception of agricultural transition, the people involved on the ground, the farming stakeholders, and looking at innovation and adoption and so forth. So we've got a very interesting group here, and we're going to hear talks from our colleagues, and then we'll have a discussion. First, I want to see what the speakers think of each other's work, and then we'll open it up for yourselves, both in the audience and online. So perhaps I could start by asking Emmeline to come and give her talk. Thanks, Emmeline.
Yes, of course. Hello, I'm Emmeline. I am a historian, and as a result, I'm going to give a little historical background on food security. My job is relatively easy because prior to the post-World War II period, there really wasn't any sort of thing as food security for anyone besides the very, very wealthy. My work focuses primarily in the United States, so that's where most of my examples come from, but obviously I will touch on the UK because that's where we are, and the history of American and British agriculture is very much intertwined. So the origins of our modern food system can largely be linked to the Industrial Revolutions. The first one happening starting in the late 18th century in the United Kingdom, the second one in the late 19th century in the United States. These are times of incredible transition, the most obvious being the huge movement of people from rural areas to cities. This means, obviously, there's less farmers, and the supply chains that bring food from farm to table are much longer, much more complex. So on the macro scale, industrialization is obviously really good for these countries because they become incredibly wealthy. On a micro scale, it seemed like this was a terrible time to be alive because by all available metrics, health declined precipitously in the population. Disease increased, death rates increased, life expectancy declined dramatically. In the United States, over the course of the 19th century, the actual height declined precipitously, and this is largely linked to poor nutrition. So the UK today, these are numbers from 2022, so I don't know how inflation has affected it, but roughly people estimate that the average household spends anywhere from 10 to 14% of their income on food. In the United States, this is roughly around 10%. In the 19th century in the United States, as America was becoming the wealthiest country in the history of the world, the average worker was spending anywhere from 50 to 75% of their income feeding themselves. So any disruption to supply chains, any increase in prices obviously had a huge impact on people's daily lives. So food security, maintaining the food supply was paramount for social, economic, and political policy. The British did this two ways. One of it was the intensification of what is called the Agricultural Revolution. This slightly predates the Industrial Revolution, but basically they're applying the scientific principles of agriculture, scientific principles to agriculture to make farmland more productive. This was largely led by upper-class Brits. How effective it was at actually mitigating food crises is a bit debatable. The other things the British did was basically turn its empire into its grocery store, and they made their colonies basically mass-produce commodities that were shipped back to an industrializing England, which is why you get, New Zealand lamb, Australian beef, South African fruit, all the sugar from the slave colonies in the Caribbean. The United States didn't rely on its empire, though it did somewhat extract food from abroad. What the United States did was twofold. One was it really emphasized nutrition science. So at its very basic fundamental origins, nutrition science was developed because people wanted to know what was the minimum amount they could feed a worker and not have him die. The other thing they did was incredibly intensify the agriculture and the agricultural lands that were under use. The United States is very blessed. It has a huge quantity of arable land, a huge quantity of very rich arable land, particularly in the Midwest, places like Iowa. So in the late 19th century, farms were transformed. It wasn't just a man with a plow in a field anymore. Farms were these more complicated entities, very linked to markets. Banks were involved, insurance companies were involved, the government was involved, agricultural scientists were involved, all with the effort to improve food production and basically provide food security for a rapidly industrializing nation. Whether they achieved this is very debatable because the whole turn of the 20th century was just marked by food crisis after food crisis. Globally, you have massive famines. A lot of these are linked to colonial extraction, particularly in places like India. Other things were just related to climate or to social structures. You have massive famines in China, massive famines in Tsarist Russia. Because farms are increasingly capitalized and linked to markets, financial crises had huge impacts on farmers. So in the 1910s, food prices reached all-time high in the United States. Then you get World War I, which obviously exploded all of these global supply chains. England was particularly hard hit because they could no longer easily import their lamb from New Zealand and their beef from Australia. Also, you get the movement of farmers to become warriors on the battlefield. Then you obviously have to feed all these armies. Whether this is apocryphal or not, the postmaster of Chicago during World War I reported that the #1 thing kids were asking Santa for Christmas was food. People were incredibly hungry, food crises were rampant, and this was in the wealthiest countries on earth. And World War I, there was a brief respite after World War I in the 1920s, because obviously when you no longer have to feed armies, it's easier to distribute your food to the people. But on the flip side, when there's no longer a war market, farmers experience a crisis because they no longer could sell their goods. And so in the United States, you get, again, a massive restructuring, a massive doubling down on these industrializations, on the mechanization of the farm. And so in the post-World War II period, this is where you get the idea of the farm as a factory, that the farm should be run in an industrial manner with the same efficiency as the factory down the road. These, of course, these developments, this intensification, the application of technology is disrupted again by the Great Depression, again by World War II. And then finally, in the post-World War II period, you get the coalescence of many factors, many of which is technological change. Another is a huge ideological shift in the United States. The government really wanted to solve the issue of food security, and this is basically the basis of the food system, at least from the Western perspective, that we have today. And basically, the United States government decided it was going to invest in 2 commodities, corn and soy, and it was going to feed that corn and soy to animals farmed in a very intensive livestock system. And so you get a huge increase in meat production, a huge increase in meat consumption. You also get a huge increase in corn products, which I'm sure you've seen in the grocery store. Absolutely everything you buy is filled with corn. And you have this on one hand, this global restructuring, so the United States is shipping not just these commodities, but also this form of agriculture worldwide. You get factory farms absolutely everywhere, based on this very same intensive system that produces these very similar commodities worldwide. The other thing you get is what is called the Green Revolution, which are basically these dramatic improvements in the productivity of specific grains, primarily wheat and rice. And as a result, for the first time, maybe not in all of human history, but at least since the Industrial Revolutions, you actually have enough calories on the planet to feed the population. And so as a result, we get a massive boom in the population. This is not obviously only driven by food, but having enough food certainly helps for this. The food system we have today is largely still this same food system, and on a certain level, it's very good at what it does. It produces very specific quantities at huge surpluses that are very cheap. And we have enough calories to go around. But obviously this food system was developed in a time that is very different from today and does not take into account the many other issues that we are facing: global inequality, the quality of those calories, food distribution, the environment. And these are, of course, things that the rest of the panel will touch on. But that is a very, very brief whirlwind history of the food system of the past 2 centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmeline. And move straight on to Tim. Thank you, Tim.
Very good. Well, she said everything. She said everything. She said everything. But I'll do it in a different way. I'm Tim Lang. My job is to try to sketch where we are in policy terms, and I'll do my best. To pick up Evelyn's last point, absolutely clearly, there is no shortage of food. It's complete nonsense. There's a surplus of food. There's overproduction, not underproduction. Humanity, however, has always had a problem with maldistribution, income, the inequalities issue Evelyn was referring to, and appalling policy frameworks. But that's not for lack of trying. Humanity's long had a battle over what to do about food, and it's a battle over resources, wealth, and land. Food follows the money like everything else. It's why the rich live when there's famine. It's why Ireland exported food in the famine. It's why it still goes on today. There's enough food. Modern thinking, however, about what we call food security, and I basically am a critic of this term. I think it's lost its meaning, food security. It means all things to all people. It's apple pie and motherhood, as the Americans would say. But a lot of the modern thinking really is appropriate for a Cambridge Science Festival, because a lot of the thinking about food security has been driven from the emergence of science and technology. It starts in the middle of the 18th century with the chemical revolution, transport, energy, and so on. But it really develops in a slow way with the biological revolution and engineering of infrastructure. But policy, basically, and policy makers have veered between accepting death on the one hand and famine and thinking humans can fix it. It's the big theme in the big Western thinkers, from Malthus to Marx to Tolstoy to John Maynard Keynes, and also the great pragmatists, the William Beveridges, the Sir John Boydore, the first Director General of the FAO, a Scot, a doctor, a nutritionist, a radical, and Sir George Stapleton, a fascist sympathizer, but the greatest soil scientist Britain's produced. Science, the STEM subjects, as we would call them now, has fed into this, mostly but not entirely as a technical fix. We've got the answer. We can provide it. Fertilizers, John Bennett Laws at Rothamsted, rivaling with his friend Justus von Liebig at Gießen, the Haber-Bosch process. Plant breeding, here, the old PBI at Cambridge, RIP. No longer with us, sold off to Unilever and then closed down, now in a former life, in a new form at UEA. Engineering, McCormick and Reapers from the States, Ferguson here in Britain, the tractor hydraulic lift. These are the things that enabled the explosion of food production to happen. But the world is actually still rehearsing very old debates, mostly about shortage when it's not there. It has been there in the past, but it's not there now. But now on environment and public health and social justice. The focus, I think, in policy terms, is much too much on supply when more needs to be on consumption. Not just the demand, but consumption. What's in our minds, not just in our mouths. The UK has a particularly troubled history on food security, for reasons Evelyn was partly referring to. In the 1840s, in the 1815 actually, with the Corn Laws after the triumph of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain said the biggest navy, the biggest power, and so on, it could get its food from elsewhere. Except Parliament said, no, it can't, you'll get it only here, by imposing the Corn Laws, which were taxes on the importation of food into Britain. It would use others to provide the cheap food when that political battle, which lasted 30 years, was resolved by the 1846 repeal of the Corn Laws. And then for 60 years, slowly, British farming went into decline. What is the point of growing food in Britain if you can get it from your empire with land, labour, cheaper than from here? This was about a split in capitalism between industrialist, finance capital, and old landed capital. It's essentially that politics. Today, we don't have that politics in the same way, but we see the residue of it. It hit the bricks in World War I. In World War I, Suddenly there was shortage, there were threats. Britain blockaded Germany. Germany fought back. It was a near thing. But essentially in 1916, after 2 years, Beveridge, the man we now think the father of the welfare state, an agricultural economist, was turned to create the new Ministry of Food, which was then recreated in World War II, attempting to bring some public policy rationality to a political economy that was assumed to be about conventional market economics. But essentially, really modern thinking about what we call food security begins in the 1930s, but is enacted in the 1940s, what people like me call productionism. The answer to food security is just produce more food. That's it, in one sentence. And that's what we're now dealing with, because the legacy of that is environmental damage, more obesity than there is hunger. There's 2.5 billion people suffering inadequate diet-related ill health than there is a mere 0.8 billion people hungry. We today face a problem which we call in my world the polycrisis. We have got ecosystems crises across the piece, public health externalities of under, mal and overconsumption, massive socioeconomic inequalities, food availability fissured by social factors. In the same household in sub-Saharan Africa, you can have obesity, hunger, and adequate eating going on. The same in Britain, the same in the rich world as well. Massive power is now not on the land or about the land, but is off the land. It's the traders and the bankers and the manufacturers and the retailers who control food. Policymaking now is finding great difficulty in addressing this. It doesn't know really what to do. At the EU, there's some adaptation, the new farm to fork strategy, just when Britain has left where it gets a third of its food from. It's actually missing the fact that we're now getting a more rational food systems approach, the theme that Evelyn was trying to get us to think about. The UK, however, is currently all over the place. We had a food security and food policy on rational terms from 2008 to 10. I was involved in the creation of it, a process that ended up with Food 2030. How many people here have heard of Food 2030? None of you. Shame on you. If you're interested in that, Britain had, for precisely 3 months before an election, swept it away. In came the coalition. Bang, it went. So we spent 3 years getting a science-based, evidence-based policy on food security, international, anti-poverty, inequalities, pro-public health, pro-social justice, saying sustainable diets from sustainable food systems. And that is what a good policy ought to be. I have to stop. We've got a problem, a very big problem. It's mostly intellectual. It's not real.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And over to Anoop for a different theme.
Okay, all the big word already said, so I'm cool. My name is Anoop Tripathi. I'm a first-year PhD student in Department of Plant Sciences, and I'm funded by Gates, Cambridge. So my work is based on plants. So there are like, by 2050, we have to feed around 10 billion people. So we have to increase the food production. So there are people in science working on increasing the food production. So they are improving the photosynthesis by doing like GM, like gene editing, putting trans gene in the plants, and there are genetics approach. What they are doing, like the breeders, they are selecting the good crops and try to breed them. And by this, like they are getting like try to increase the food production. And so my research is based on grafting. So you might have heard about grafting. So you have seen, like, if you go, like, just go in wild and just looking in the plants, you can see sometimes like plants are twinkled up and they're just connected. That's like a nature grafting. And like in nature, grafting is there. And there's like, if you see, there are like some plants which grow on other plants. So there's like a striga, one of the dicot plant. It's just go on the plants and try to feed from there and make a really good graft. And yeah, there are like so many things, like natural grafting, and you have seen grafting mainly on like horticulture purposes. You have seen like different roses put together, and you have like in one plant, you have different colored roses. That's the main like concept of grafting. So grafting has been done so far for dicots. So what's the like dicots? There are like two like big classes, like a dicot plants, monocot plants. So in dicot plants, so it's like if you see chickpea, beans, so these are dicot plants. Like if you take their seeds out, try to push them, you see there's like a two cotyledons. So they are dicots. And there's monocots. So monocot plants are like wheat, rice, millet, sorghum. What you see, there's like one seed, that's the monocot plants. So in dicot plants, grafting is easy because when you see their vasculature, when you cut the plant, if you see their vasculature, so they are arranged in a ring form, and their meristematic tissue present there is just like, meristematic tissue is like a stem cell, and it is like good in developing new tissue. So you can really easily graft dicot plants. But grafting monocot is really difficult because the vasculature is scattered, they are not ring form, like no particular structure, and there is cambium absent. So we recently grafted monocots, and it's never been done. We did it first time. We published a paper in Nature, and we managed to graft monocots at like an embryo level. So we get the embryo out, grafted them, and we successfully grafted the monocots. So that's the start of one thing. So now it's been done, like, yeah, now we can do monocot grafting. So there are so many monocots, like rice, and there is like if you can see millets. So if you put them in their photosynthetic ability, so they go on, like one plants, like millets, they call C4 plants, because they do a different kind of photosynthesis, and rice do a different kind of photosynthesis. It's called C3. So because rice, when it goes through photosynthesis, it produces some toxic compound, and it wasted some energy to get rid of that compound. But C4 have a different anatomy, and they just skip that part. So they are really efficient. If you put like a rice plant and a maize plant, and if you grow them in like 2 months, like in 2 months' time or 1 month time, you can see the rice plants is this big, but you see like maize plant or sugarcane plants this big. That's why, because they are really efficient with photosynthesis. So these both like these like C3, C4 photosynthesis, and they both are monocots. So I'm trying to graft these monocots together. So one is better photosynthetic, the other is less photosynthetic. So I'm trying to combine them and get like new crops out of them. So because I'm from India, so I know, I have seen rice cultivation, and like by hand, I know how to do rice cultivation. So I know the problems where it comes from, how the irrigation is done, how important like every step is challenging. So I try to make a rice which can grow in like less water condition, because rice use a lot of water, but millet can grow in high temperature, less water condition. If I can get those characters from millet to the rice, then I can make like the crop, like the different, like better rice. And yeah, so that's like my PhD is based on. So I'm going to do that. And there is already, there's a RIPE project which is focusing on like a photosynthesis pathway, and there is a C4 rice project which is already going on C3, C4. So these two big projects, and they are approaching the C3 and C4-ness like a different approach. Mine is a different tangent, and it's just allowing the genome to mix up. There is no like GM, no editing, it's just a natural process. I'm just making them together. And if I'll make a better, like a rice which can grow in like low water condition and high temperature, and with climate change, it will be really helpful. And if it goes through, we can mix different genomes and get the plants out. That's my research. Yeah.
Thank you. Great, Anoop, thanks. Many thanks, Anoop. And finally, David.
Now, the great advantage of going last is if you haven't prepared, you can just say you agree with what's been said before and pinch it. Or the disadvantage is if you have prepared, and I have written something down, if it's already been said, you look like you're nicking it and you haven't prepared. But if a good point is a good point, it's worth saying twice, I think. And it's a great pleasure to follow a historian, a food policy specialist, a plant scientist. I'm a geographer from Cranfield University, because I think, as we've seen in the previous talks, food security is so multifaceted that it requires multiple forms of expertise to solve it, and not least our food producers, our supply chain actors, retailers, manufacturers, our policymakers, and maybe there are some in the room, maybe there are some watching. But I want to take us back in this final talk to definitions of food security, and there were many, but one could be the state of having reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. And of course, it is true that part of that jigsaw puzzle is supplying enough food for people, producing enough food. But it's only one part of that question. As we've heard, you can have plentiful food produced, but some people might not be able to have access to it because they are too poor to afford it, or because they don't have access to an education to understand what a nutritious diet looks like, or because some people overconsume or we waste food, or because corruption or trade barriers prevent some people from getting food. So production of food is only one part of the equation. And thinking of food producers, farmers and growers in this country, most of my work focuses on the UK, farmers and growers facing many, many challenges, not least the incessant pushing of a cheap food narrative we have in this country. We must keep food as cheap as possible. Now, that still might mean it's not cheap if you are poor, but we have cheap food narratives. Farmers and growers expected to produce food that often, with retailers not paying the cost of production, it's not a farmer or grower's fault that some people in society are poor, or that corruption exists, or that some of these other problems in the food supply chain exist. And picking up on what Tim was saying with the Food 2030 strategy, over 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, we've very recently, had another big national food strategy that some of you may have read. A strategy that tried to create a vision for what the UK food system should look like. Ideas to tackle inequality, food waste, dietary change. Again, I could ask how many people have read the National Food Strategy. Now, you may have very recently heard about it because the person who wrote that strategy has been on all the political programmes in the last week because he has resigned his position from government in protest that National Food Strategy has been kicked into the long grass. Now, one of the reasons I think I was asked here tonight was to talk about the role of technology. We do a lot of work looking at technology adoption by farmers. And it is true that certain technologies associated with the so-called fourth agricultural revolution, AI, gene editing, drones, robotics, vertical farming, cultured meat, insects, lots of different technologies or alternative food systems could help us to produce more food on less land, potentially solving some production challenges, benefiting the environment, taking the pressure off existing agricultural land. There are positives. Technology has done wonderful things, and many of those solutions can offer solutions to some of our challenges. And technology is a very seductive solution. So we have a government in this country completely seduced by the technology silver bullet. So we've got some labour shortages in the horticulture sector caused by Brexit. Let's get robots to pick the fruit instead. So we've got climate change that's affecting our ability to have import non-seasonal fruit. We've seen in North Africa and the South Mediterranean. Let's do some gene editing and then we can make our crops more resistant to pests and diseases and more tolerant to certain climates. Technology can be a seductive solution because the technology cavalry comes in and solves the problem without society or without policymakers having to actually do anything to change the way the society works. It's much easier. And I think it's worth remembering that despite all the benefits that technology in agriculture has given, Green Revolution onwards, technology has done and can do harm as well as benefit. Some of these technologies we hear about now, robotics, drones, gene editing, they have the potential to exacerbate inequalities in some part of the world, to create labour shortages, to harm animal welfare if used in the wrong way, to present health and safety challenges, to exacerbate problems with data ownership and privacy, all sorts of potential downsides of technology use as well. And even if many of these technology solutions hold great promise, and many of them do, it's important not to get carried away with the hype that we're going to have a technology revolution that's rapid and quick and is going to solve all of our problems tomorrow. Even if policymakers wish they would solve our problems tomorrow, they're not going to. Because if we look at history, technology in agriculture very rarely, sometimes, but very rarely, is adopted very quickly. Technology adoption in agriculture can be slow because of reliability issues, cost, infrastructure, skills, habit, all sorts of reasons why farmers and growers find it difficult to adopt technology. So it's not going to be quick. So I just wanted to leave us with the questions that I think we've touched on already. You hear technology pushed as a solution to our food security issues. Just ask yourself, and people watching too, why do you think that might be the case? Is it because these technologies are game changers? Or is it because putting our faith in technology is easier than having to get to grips with the problems that have been caused by political failure and may well involve changes that mean that current powerful actors in the food system become slightly less powerful? Mm-hmm. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much to our 4 very stimulating speakers for giving us masses of food for thought and throwing up a whole bunch of issues. And I'd like to just kick off by returning something that Tim said. There's enough food. There's something we need to really have a look at, that in a sense there's enough food to feed 10 billion human beings in 2050. So we don't actually need Anoop. Anoop should do something else with his life, shouldn't he? Because we don't need any fancy. We were all terribly excited, Anoop, to hear about that grafting. I mean, it's really exciting to hear about your science, and I love it. But Tim says we don't need it. So what do you reckon?
I don't know, like, yeah.
I agree with it, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, why you think, like, we don't need...
My point is that there's enough, more than adequate calories to feed the world. It's a problem of maldistribution. It's what David was partly getting at, well, rightly getting at, which is maldistribution. It's the politics of food, politics of land, politics of where the money is. It's not to say that you're not going to be needed. Yeah. He's being provocative. Ignore him. Ignore him, even though he's the chair. The point is that you're not going to be, the danger is that you could be used as a technical fix when you're a social visionary. That's David's point. It's society, stupid. It's not genes.
But do you think we have to change our approach to, like, according to the climate change and, like, what you are mentioning, the technology?
That's why you'll be needed. That's why you'll be needed. But you'll be needed, unless David is answered with social change, you'll still be misused.
Good.
David, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with both. I think I occupy the middle ground. Technology is not a solution to poverty. Technology is not a solution to many of these social and political challenges. However, with a realist head-on, and I think it's a great shame because we've had opportunities, many opportunities in this country and elsewhere to deal with these issues. But I don't think dietary change, social inequality, all of these very difficult problems are going to be solved overnight. No. So therefore, if we want to produce more food, protect the environment, do those things, technology will be needed to do that. I'm a great advocate of many of these precision agriculture solutions. If we can develop technologies to grow more food in a more precise way, target plants in a way that doesn't degrade the environment, all of those things, even take the pressure off the land by producing food on non-traditional agricultural land, I think that's all great. I don't think it's an either or. Fantastic solutions, but those solutions shouldn't be used as a sticking plaster hides our inability to deal with social problems that are the cause of
So
some
David,
of these
you
issues.
your research is looking at the reception of these things. So as you said, at a certain level we need them, but we don't just need them to line pockets of the companies. We need them to get to the people who need to produce and eat.
Yep.
So how do we do that?
Well,
We can see how a new tech solution, we can see how someone can make money out of it. How do we get it to people who are hungry?
Yep.
What's your...
Well, I mean, we do a lot of work on technology adoption. So firstly is trying to put the power to develop technology partially in the hands of producers. I'm a great advocate of co-producing solutions. If you look at farmers, their inability sometimes to adopt technology, it's either caused by the fact that we don't address their intention to use, we don't help them want to use or show the benefits of technology where they exist, or in many cases it's often because they can't use it. We blame farmers for not using technology, but actually we don't help them with the skills and the advice and the infrastructure, etc., grants to be able to support technology. So I think it's helping farmers as far as possible adapt. Some farmers find it much easier to adapt to new ways of farming and new technology than others, and we must help those who are least able to adapt, particularly in parts of the developing world. And then I think that helps producers be able to benefit from these technologies. And also, there's a big piece about data ownership, data privacy, to ensure that farmers and growers themselves benefit, and not just the John Deeres, etc., of the world, who can benefit quite a lot by the uptake of these technologies and all the data that is gathered.
Thanks. I'd like to bring in Emlyn here, because one thing I really came strong from David and Emlyn's talk was how, as is true in all subjects, in the UK, we know a lot about the UK. We know a lot about what's going on in the UK and the UK's history, and a number of the structures you talk about relate to policy in the UK. Now, I believe I'm right in saying that around the world, over 50% of farmers farm on farms of less than 2 hectares. What from your... And again, those are in places where they don't have universities, they don't have communities like ourselves with lots of grant money and time to think about these things. Is any of the knowledge that rich knowledge from the UK, which frankly is hungry in parts, but not as hungry as many parts of the world, that could be transferred to parts of Asia and Africa where farmers are farming, where the norm is to farm less than 2 hectares? Do you want to kick off with that, Emily?
Well, so obviously my perspective is more American, and from the American perspective, mainly the United States has just imported either its products or its view of what these products should be.
Yeah.
There's actually huge problems of basically the U.S. doesn't quite directly support animal agriculture, but if it got rid of various price supports it had, there was some study that came out of Columbia University that said basically immediately 300 million people would be lifted out of poverty. Because the U.S. has such an efficient efficient agriculture system that's geared to produce so much surplus that it has a huge market share worldwide, and the fact that it can export these products basically lets it dominate markets in Africa and Asia. So one of the solutions would be basically to get the United States out of these markets. The issue is obviously that comes with the other issue that you all of a sudden remove a huge quantity of very cheap food, where very cheap food, particularly very cheap protein, like chicken, is very needed. So it's a difficult situation. But at least from the U.S. perspective also, they are exporting agricultural knowledge, exporting in the form of food aid. That's a big form of soft power for the United States. So these partnerships already definitely do exist. A lot of them definitely do benefit American agricultural systems. But they are there. They are working. I'm sure you can speak to more.
Yeah, no, one good example is from last year where I was asked by the FAO as part of a range of different experts to contribute to their State of Agriculture report 2022. This was on the role of autonomous solutions, mainly robotics, in improving food security in the Global South. So I was one of many experts, mainly agricultural economists, but others who wrote a report. And in my report, there were lots of sections. One was the danger of colonial ideas of technology transfer. One example from the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading of where the British government thought it would be fantastic to try and mechanise and have peanut production, and I think it was in Tanzania, and of course that didn't work at all, but we thought we had the solutions and it would work, and it caused huge problems. So I said, firstly, beware of applying solutions developed in one place to another. And secondly, just have a look at smallholder agriculture and how things work here. The drivers for autonomous robotics in this country, labour shortage, etc., may not be so strong in other parts of the world. In many parts of the world, there isn't a shortage of labour.
That's right. And
rural employment is a huge part, an important part of the economy. Some of the economies of scale are not the same. In the report I wrote them, looking at some very basic digital extension methods, the use of videos on a smartphone in parts of Africa. Some research that was done on a digital extension program in Rwanda, much heralded, but then they found only 3% of people had access to a smartphone and they couldn't make it work. So are we thinking autonomous robotics?
Yes.
So I think it's a powerful point to always be clear on, well, wherever you are, what is the problem? What is the cause of lack of food security? Why is this happening? And don't assume, just because it's worked in one place, that it'll work in another. That's a classic geographer's statement, but it's true.
It is.
So, Anoop, you actually, you're from South Asia. You know farmers.
Yeah. And that's why I was like, just like what they're saying. I'm just like, in my head, I was like, I just see the harvester on the screen. I was like, there is the field. If you just try on the harvester, run for like 10 meters, the field is done. The whole farmer, so how can he going to adopt this technology for the harvesting? And they have like a small land holding, and the irrigation system is based on like a number system. So today I'm irrigating, tomorrow, because their land are so scattered, so they cannot like use, like in India we use a tube well, like underground water. So it's like you cannot bore like everywhere. So it's really hard to put technologies like in developing worlds, like even like post-harvest technologies, which is going in India, like the big market and everything coming and getting the produce from the farmers. But they're buying like for like £2 and selling it for like £10 or £20, and the farmers are not getting any credit, any benefit. So I don't know like how these policy and these technologies are really good for, because Indian agriculture, because it's not like only few parts of like India. If we go to north part of India where Green Revolution happened, the Punjab area, their farmers have like a huge land holding, and they have these big, and it's working fine. But most of like part of India, if you see, the farmers, they don't have like, they cannot use this technology to adapt to this because the policy is not good, and they cannot afford the technology. And if they afford the technology, it's not worth spending that kind of money. Mm-hmm. So it's like really, that's what I was like when you're explaining the robotics and everything. I was like, and I'm thinking about my research. I'm just thinking about getting the good seed to them. That's it. Because that's the first thing they need. Everything is for this, like at this point of time, I don't know how they are going to like benefit them directly. So unless and until like there is a good policy, what they are producing, how they are selling is not up to like, we are not ready for that. And I think when we reach like a good point there, then when we can start putting the technology and everything in there. Because if they produce well, like even if you put like really, like if you put like a really good variety of rice, so if it's producing like really good, so it need like a really good fertilizer. After producing, they need a post-harvest, like how to harvest it, how to like transport them from one place to, if we just give them that like seed, and they just like destroying the whole nutrient, and they're just like rotting, and it's like, what's the point of like, so that's why it's like, I understand like your technology, but how we can like implement those in that scenario, so that's why.
Thank you, Tim.
I don't know whether you can see it. We're looking here at a screen that says, and this is what we're discussing, how can we improve our food security? We'll never be rude about your host, but I'm now going to be. Who's the we? Who's the are? That's basically the big issue. Because it requires different solutions at different levels for different people. And I disagreed, again, if I may. with your question, you know, what can we in Britain do for everyone else? I mean, I'm with you politically with a small p, but that's actually not where we are now. We're in a multi-level world. We're in a multi-agency world. Britain is a declined post-imperial power that still has delusions. Isn't even feeding itself sustainably. It's importing its food from where it says it's got an economic distance from. It's now saying, what are we going to do? If we switch away from the EU, are we going to get our food from what? The empire? Well, there isn't one. Protected in the next World War III by what navy? 70 boats. 2 aircraft carriers, one of which hasn't even got any planes. A border force that has 17 rubber boats that can't stop migrants. You know, let's get a bit real about the politics of food. It's frankly not been a priority for the British. And you, the Americans, blame us, we can blame you. Because you took over from the British imperial power.
Yes, we did.
Not you personally, I think. You know, there's a bit of humility, in my view, needed about the food security debate. It's utterly, it makes me, I mean, I'm 75 and 50 years I've worked in and on this, and I've kind of had my fill of people saying, I've got the answer. Just let people get on with it. Let the small farmers of India get on with it. You know, they've, you know, as David said, that's the co-creation model of letting people do it. And the hard politics for me is actually this. I'll now answer my own question, not your question, which is that it's compared to when my heroes, the 1930s and 40s scientists, said, let's produce more. That's going to be the answer to food security. That'll resolve India's problem. Now we're in a multi-criteria world. It's not just more, it's how. It's not just the environment, it's soil, it's water. Tell me the Brit or the European or the American who thinks about their food as embedded water. Not even thinking about it as embedded carbon, let alone land use, the sorts of things that geographers like David are dealing with. And this is a much more complicated world. Now, I work in policy, and I am deep, well, the reason I get out of bed still working on this, as my lovely wife knows only too well, is because I'm still actually angry at the stupidity of my own country and of our generation of policymakers of not realizing what we've all been talking about tonight. They're still in a fantasy world that somehow it's we can sort this for other people. Actually, the problem is us. We're over-consuming. We focus too much on farming. Can I say that? I'm an ex-farmer. We spend too much time talking about farmers in Europe. In India, great. Very important. Africa, very important. Latin America, very important. China, very important. Britain, what is it, David? 100,000, 93,000 farmers? You know, the money in the rich world is all off the land. Farming is squeezed, completely squeezed, and the money is all made off the land. That power politics lies at the misjudging of that power politics, it seems to me, is our political problem. If we want to improve our food security, which I think we do, it's got to be done in different ways in different parts of the world. With that sort of understanding of the complexity of the modern world, it's not just a problem of shortage. That's why I said at the beginning, there's enough food. We need to know that. But actually, how we're growing that food is disastrous, so that he will be needed, but not for the reasons that Bill Gates funds you. You know, it's a different, more complicated world. It's society that's our problem in food security.
Thank you, Tim. Well, let's open it up for questions, both for the audience and online. I don't know whether we lift the lights at this point, do we? Or I just got to keep my eyes open.
We can start with a question which we've had come in online, if you like, just while we're getting the microphones around. And the question we've had come in on Slido is, are food prices really down to the impact of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, or is there something else behind the rise in the cost of food on your supermarket shelf?
Who'd like to have a go at that?
Well, I can have a go. I'll be very quick. Good question. The food system is a just-in-time food system. It's like stretched rubber bands, and bits are going, bits are fraying. 1 minute it's a bit of the environment. The Ukraine war has completely disrupted the grain market. 2 of the biggest grain producers in the world are now basically partly withdrawn, or Russia is actually determining what can and can't get onto world markets. That's the main driver of it. But what's exposed is the fact that the productionist model was based upon gas. Gas being turned with the Haber-Bosch, STEM stuff again, into fertilizers, which has given us a huge explosion of productivity and production. And all of that is no longer quite fitting. That's what's going on. There's some profiteering, some speculation. China, India, US have almost all the world's grain stocks. Everyone else has stopped stocking food. There are no stockpiles.
Did you want to come in on that, David?
Yeah, no, just also the Russia, Ukraine, places where we get ingredients for fertilizer from, the cost of energy has affected farmers and growers. So the cost of production has gone up massively. Retailers not really wanting to pay that greater cost of production. They don't want to put prices up in the supermarket shelves. But our farmers and growers in this country are really suffering because their energy costs have gone through the roof, other input costs have gone through the roof. And society, all of society cannot afford to pay higher prices for food because of some of the problems that we've been talking about today. So farmers and growers are really in a catch-22.
They are.
And retailers could do more about it. And they've tried to say it's nothing to do with us, it's climate change, but retailers could do something more about it if they wanted to.
It's been 70 years of investment in this system is now hitting its cotton wool walls. We've got very little time to resolve this.
Yeah. I have 2 questions. If I could take your question first and then your question. Thanks.
Mine. Okay, thank you very much. It was really, really interesting to hear all the view on a topic that I know really very little. One thing that worries me, I can see, or I can take with me this notion that we got plenty of food, but it's not well distributed, but we got plenty. What worries me is that we tend to, I can see how the PhD project is very interesting because we can think of climate change and what we can do about crossing the plants in order to get benefits. But what worries me is that we go for bigger and bigger volumes of less nutrient content, and we know that that's associated with disease. So we are kind of going round and round, doing, to me, it seems like the wrong thing. We produce large quantities of something that is very cheap, of very little nutrient value. So I want to hear your comments about that.
Thank you. Who'd like to kick off on this one? Do you want to have a go, Anoop?
Yeah, so there's like people are developing new crops, like recently Crop Science and NIAB, they have came up with like a barley, and they have used gene editing, and they are using gene editing to make the fungi, which is already in the soil, interacting with the plant, and you don't use that much fertilizer to feed them. It will, fungi and the plant association will make like better quality of. So gene editing is like, so we are using gene editing. Yeah. So that's the one.
But Anoop, the example you use there is barley. It's not one of the top 3, but it's one of the top 10, isn't it?
Yes.
Can one, in terms of really getting to food quality and so forth, can one really get away from supplying calories to supplying diverse, nutritious food?
Well, when they developed the system, they thought meat was the ultimate
technical fix.
What?
Yeah,
they thought that the fact that we could produce huge abundant quantities of beef in particular was the fact that we are truly nourishing our people. We are our strong nation because we have so much beef, we waste 30% of it. The problem is obviously this system has so much capital investment, has so much government investment, there's so much physical structure going into the particular meat system that even as nutrition science has changed, it's very hard to sort of modify away from this very particular model of what is good food. Just think about it. The Netherlands right now is trying to actually physically reduce the amount of meat that they produce, and it has huge backlash. because so many people, for cultural, for personal reasons, love meat, and part of this is because they do believe it is nutritious. It is nutritious on a certain level, but obviously we are missing a lot when we only eat cheap cuts of meat.
How many of you knew what Evelyn was just saying about the Netherlands? 3, 4, 5 of you. What's going on is basically the Netherlands government is really, the Netherlands and Sweden, about the only governments that are really trying to take a multi-criteria crisis seriously. And they've introduced a nitrogen, basically it's nitrogen reduction strategy, which to be able to do that, it's got to reduce meat. And it's one of the 10 planetary boundaries. We've exceeded it. We're producing too much nitrogen. It's been used as a technical fix to grow more fertilizers. And what Evelyn is getting at is that there's a farmers' party has been created, which is now the second largest party, looks like being in the next election. It's going to unroll that. So in other words, the Netherlands is going to actually undo being a progressive country on this. For me, who's a policy watcher, this is really interesting. This is unfortunately very bad news, but you can understand it for the reasons that David just said, that the farmers are squeezed. They're caught on these high energy inputs. They've been told for 70 years, use fertilizers, use all of these technical fixes to grow more. And now they're being told, well, it's bad for the environment. Unfortunately, it's actually good policy making, meeting us being slow to go along with it.
David.
So it's crazy politics, crazy politics.
No, it's a really good question. I'd advise that you look at the National Food Strategy. One of the big things was, well, looking at, in this country, trying to produce more of the nutritious food that we need. Fruit and veg was a big theme throughout it. And you hear a lot about the crisis that the NHS is in. The NHS is in crisis because, unfortunately, it's having to deal with problems that it wasn't set up for. It's having diabetes, other problems caused by obesity and eating bad food is crippling the NHS. But the National Food Strategy looked at, we need to encourage more fruit and veg production in the UK, to encourage people to eat it more. We have a wonderful climate to produce things like apples and pears, but we import a staggering amount of them.
2/3.
We had some very good ideas, some good ideas in our strategy about, well, when consumers go into a shop, instead of being engineered to buy unhealthy stuff with buy one, get one free offers, we could look at trying to move them towards buying healthier food. What happened to that? Nothing. So we are actively encouraging consumers to buy unhealthy food and also not providing support to, in this country, grow some of the healthier food that we could grow if there was more support for it. But some of our top fruit, apple and pear farmers, are in a real crisis because of things like labour shortages and other things that are really stopping their ability to expand.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your patience. Yes, indeed. You.
Right, thanks everyone. It's complicated. I just wanted to pick up on, you touched on the National Food Strategy. So we had Tim, you mentioned the 2030 report. We've had the National Food Strategy. Don't we need to take this outside of politics and move away from short-term election cycles where it just, they're commissioning reports and just choosing to ignore it? I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, maybe more of a bottom-up approach, like from primary food producers, farmers, communities, consumers, etc., rather than waiting for a top-down fix from government, which might change next year and another election cycle and so forth.
I was recently an interloper at a conference full of huge corporate food entities like Nestle, Kellogg, and absolutely none of them had any sort of interest in engaging with the government. I don't have an answer. I mean, they have their own $1 billion investment, but it's very telling that the biggest agents in the food world have no faith in government policy whatsoever, which I'm sure you can speak to.
I can,
to a bigger extent. Yeah. I mean, I don't have beyond that. They're just investing in their own specific supply chain. Sustainability, supply chain tracing was a huge thing. Carbon markets, very hot right now, according to this conference. But
except it said nothing about food security. I mean, I'm a great fan of Henry Dimbleby, whom we're talking about, by the way, if you didn't know. And he did a great job, but he didn't deal with what we're talking about here. It's the elephant in the room in his report, actually, because it was seen as going against the market. To address these problems, you have to suspend any conventional market economic thinking. You start having to say, there's a role for a facilitative state, or else you actually, if you withdraw from it, you end up with exactly what Evelyn's witnessed, which is corporates becoming quasi-state and acting without any accountability at all, other than through a narrow marketplace. So I'm someone who argues for not benign state, but very clear, limited, facilitative state in the public interest. But I take the questioner's point absolutely, which is unless there's some bottom-up from the people, that's why
So what bottom-up
things like this are really important. It's us, educating ourselves. We're in Cambridge. Did you know Cambridge MP is the shadow Labour Minister of Food? If you're from Cambridge, you should be lobbying him and speaking to him and making sure he gets your views.
Yeah.
So any other comments on bottom-up structures?
This is a good question. I'm not going to try and improve democracy. We've been having a go at that since the Greeks. But what I would say is, go and have a look at work that some, very much a bottom-up movement that some farmer groups and farming organisations are doing in the UK.
Yeah, they are.
Some of our regenerative agroecological farmers look at pasture for life, look at agroecology. There's many farmers in this country farming differently, not because they necessarily are being told to or being given actually a lot of support to do it, but because they want to farm in a different way, because their values want to do nature-friendly farming and produce food with different values.
Is that largely as individual farmers, or are there
individuals and groups of farmers and groups of farmers who are talking online, who are meeting, forming groups around the country? There's wonderful examples of it, who farm in a different model without necessarily having to receive support to do so. So it's not just government intervention top-down. Things are happening already, local food movements, etc. So it's happening, albeit in relatively small scale.
Is that happening in India too, Anoop? Are there groupings of farmers? Are things like mobile phone technology allowing groupings of farmers?
So it's not like a group of people, but like the people who, they are educated, they go for like IT job or something outside, they learn about the farming, come back, and they start doing businesses. So there are people who are doing growing spices, and they are doing organic farming. So people, they are not in groups, but there are individual people who like different areas. They are trying to do more like sustainable farming and like organic farming, and more and they're making like a lot of money. And they don't, they are not doing like traditional rice wheat thing.
I'm very struck by how different this conversation is from a conversation we had 50 years ago. I heard 50 years ago Keith Griffin lecture on the Green Revolution, and when he started his research into food and poverty, the majority of the world were unable to read the instructions on a bag of fertilizer. Literary, in the last 50 years, literary rates have doubled, and now the question is, does the farmer have access to 2G, 3G, or 4G, and can they get information on the phone? So it's a very it's a
different world.
It's a different world and a changing conversation.
We should listen to India more. If you look at this, I'm now acting like a geographer. In terms of people fed per space of land use to grow food, follow India. Ignore Britain, ignore America, ignore Brazil. They're commodity producers. India, the average, what is it, per feeding a household for less than half a hectare, less than half an acre. It's tiny. Why? Because they don't eat meat. Don't eat meat, dairy, but not meat. It's the dietary change. We've got to stop thinking, I'm being heretical here, think more about consumers, the mass of mouths, than the mass of farmers. Unless we get a grip of dietary change, frankly, the juggernaut of intensive production will carry on, and it's the biggest user of water, the biggest user of land, the biggest polluter of seas and water. Farming is our problem. It's consumers who've got to make it the solution.
Thank you. Before I ask you to ask a question, can I just check whether there are other online questions as well?
We do have another online question, which is about...
I just wanted to check. So if we have your question first and then the online question, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Doesn't this basically come down to the more like a PR problem at the end? Because what we heard here is, even amongst us here, many people, or even most people, didn't even hear about many of the items you spoke of in terms of policies and plans and those kind of things, right? So, and as we all know, policies and politics shifts when the society needs or society views changes. So doesn't it come down to vectors of informing societies about those problems? And how can we actually tackle this? Because at least from what I'm hearing here, that the biggest issue is people even don't know about those issues.
Right. Is that something you could speak to, David?
Well, I mean, I take your point. I think for some decades now, we often fall into a deficit model of understanding mode, where we think if only we educated people, they'll come to the right answer. So I do think we have to be careful about just educating people. What I would say, it's about helping consumers to make the right choices. I said this earlier. So you can educate a consumer all you like on what is healthy and what isn't healthy. If they walk into a supermarket and they are engineered to go for a multi-buy offer on, you know, packet of Twix instead of something more healthy, then no matter what you're telling them, it's easier, cheaper, you are pushing them towards a different decision. And that's where I think part of the National Food Strategy was good, because it was trying to say, look, how do we reinforce the good behaviours that many of us know that we need to do, but we're getting other signals from society that we should do something else. So I think it's making sure that wherever we're doing the education, in reality, where we are buying and consuming food, that we have signals that match that education.
Taxation policies, sorry, can help with this, right? With the factors, like whenever a consumer comes to a market and has the ability to choose what he or she buys,
Yeah.
the taxation, like with the sugar, right?
Yeah.
We tax the sugar, so now some products are more expensive, and people tend to, even though more people still, a lot of people still buy those products, but they are more expensive than the quote-unquote alternatives, if there are there.
The soft drinks industry level, the 5-year monitoring of that fiscal intervention is being done here at Cambridge. I'm on the advisory group of it. And it's shown very cleverly and carefully how actually raising a tax on sugary drinks has lowered consumption. But the main impact it's had, a main thing it's had, is it forced the companies to reformulate. And this we've seen in the States, we've seen it in about 20 countries. When you tax a food, behavior does change. But the point that David's making is that the National Food Strategy, Henry Dimbleby's second report, that had precisely 3 hours before Boris Johnson dismissed it as nanny state. You know, this is big politics, this is. It was very good, the National Food Strategy, on this issue about behaviour change and the immediate environment. I mean, it's £1 billion is spent on advertising basically salty, sugary, fatty foods in Britain. The amount of money that goes on promoting fruit and vegetables is piddling and small compared to it. You know, it's not even David and Goliath in terms of inequalities of it. So the enormity of trying to change consumption is some really big politics, capital P. And I will say there was a very big difference, let me say, between the National Food Strategy, which was all arm's length, mustn't change too much of the market. And when it did suggest changes to the market, it was dismissed. Whereas actually the Food 2030 strategy that came out in January 2010 had gone through 3 years at the top and was launched with prime ministerial support. The mistake, the lesson that we learned from that, because it was dismissed by Cameron, by the Tories, who it was a coalition government. Let me be very party political. I'm not speaking party politically, but it was. It was a Labour government that did it. In comes a coalition. Conservatives completely dominated the DEFRA, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. No Lib Dems on that committee. It was gone within 2 months, withdrawn within 2 months. The lesson we learned from that, if you don't get it in law, those targets, it won't survive. We got the Climate Change Act, 2008, in law. The Conservatives were frightened. There was a lot of the Conservative government wanted to get rid of it. In fact, it would have taken too much parliamentary time to do it. So third time, when we go next time for a national food strategy, it's got to be in law. Absolutely clear in law, or the next government can come in and change it too easily. They can always change it, but it's too easy. So there are some big political lessons with a small p. And I was in front of a select committee just last week and 3 weeks ago. This is the lesson they're beginning to have to realize. That and there are people on all sides, across all shades, who know the food system's got to be changed. And it's not going to be done by the Jacob Rees-Moggs. You know, he's fine, he's rich, he can eat what he likes. But if you want to have a food system that's socially just, we've got to get it in law that everyone's got to have a right to food. India has a law. India, Brazil, South Africa are the only countries in the world that have in their constitutions, it's their right, anyone's right to be fed. Whether they get it is a different matter.
Yeah, just briefly.
But it's in law. Get it in law.
Yeah. Super briefly. It's more than just taxation too. Let's just speak up for our farmers and growers here too. Trade policy has a lot to do with it. Yeah. So it is true that we need to be transitioned towards eating a little less meat, but the meat that we do eat has to be good quality, grass-fed, sustainable, and we have some wonderful producers in this country that do that. When you get free trade policies that make it cheaper for a retailer to bring in very poor quality environmental and welfare beef from Brazil and Uruguay and elsewhere, and retailers will stock that, and it's cheaper, so people are more able to buy it, as opposed to better quality welfare and environmental meat from this country, then we have a problem as well. So it's taxation, it's trade, it's all these things that have to push us towards better animal welfare, environmental, healthier food.
Thank you. Yes, Emily.
Oh, I was to say, just also from the long-term historical perspective, and as somebody who personally loves food, the only real driver of long-term culinary change is basically money. Yeah. Food trends come and go, but in the United States, at least the only major changes in the diet have been driven by corporations and the government. So if you really want to do these, so chicken, for example, chicken was basically forced on people through a combination of intensive investment in the chicken industry and government support, which basically made it super abundant and super cheap. People didn't eat chicken in massive quantities before this. This all happened in roughly the 1960s, and now it's a staple everywhere. So I think focusing on consumer choice on a certain level, yes, it's important, but I think it is really deflects from the real drivers of what drives food onto our plates, and that's where the money is.
If you want to change the British diet, what's the lesson? Have a war. It's the only evidence. Dietary change is massive very quickly in a war, because suddenly all the balance changes. What we've had is a shift in peacetime over the last 30, 40 years in a sort of enormousness of market-led. It's a very sobering reality. Yeah. It takes a war to change the diet for the better.
We've got a few questions lined up. We'll start with the online question.
And it kind of follows on from the point you were just making. And the question was, what should we be eating?
Sustainable diets. It's got to be low carbon, multi-nutrient. Well, David said it. Well, we've all said it in different ways.
I want to taste Anoop's grafted cereal. That sounds pretty tasty.
Does it
lots
taste
of
good?
plants, lots of plants.
Yeah, but it should. I don't know. I'm just like in the middle of that. So I don't know. It should.
Isn't it the lesson for everything in life? Isn't it everything in moderation? A little bit of everything. Local, seasonal. A little bit of meat, plant-based. Could be insects. It could be all sorts of different things.
Variety.
But it's a balance and variety.
Variety. It's diversity. I think the key word we should be using more is diversity, actually. What is it? This is your area. 4 plants? The geographer should know. 3 or 4 plants that dominate the world's food system. Yeah. And half of them are fed to animals. You know, huge land use from that. If we stop, David's point of grass-fed in Britain, less feeding lots. The pressure at the moment is to get British farmers to become American.
What's the historian's view? You've seen change. So turn it around to the future, be a futurologist. What are we going to eat?
In terms of what we should, I think...
Or what will we be eating in 200 years' time?
I think...
Pills.
Oh, The optimist in me hopes for a local diet, but the historian in me thinks we're just going to eat more chicken and live quantities of chicken.
But we'd have bred the chicken to be full of vitamin C.
Yeah, I mean, they'll be incredible chickens, but it'll just be a lot.
Yeah, the only thing is chickens are main vector. I sat on a committee recently. There are 200 zoonoses waiting. Most of them are poultry-based. I can actually see a world. Well, I hope I don't see it, but I can see a world where poultry get wiped out because they are the form of the vector. They are the vector.
I hope your question will cheer us up and it's not about chickens. Is that?
Have we got any vets here? Any vets here? This is veterinarian.
Please, go ahead with your question.
We've talked a lot about sort of the government level interventions and then lots about the farmers. It seems like all of the power and all of everything's in the middle, right? But are all the companies and the supermarkets and everyone who gets the food from the farm to us, are they engaged with any of this food security stuff? Do they have much interest in making things more sustainable or us having a more sort of balanced diet? And are they playing ball, or are they just chasing money?
But in a very limited way. Pepsi-Cola set out to reduce its carbon footprint by 50 in 5 years, 10 years ago. It got it down by 30%. How? By reducing it in the packaging. It was still selling sugary water. So, I mean, I'm not knocking them for that. It was actually very good and very interesting at one level. There is engagement. Don't have any illusions. Evelyn was right. They're watching this like a hawk. They want to survive. Governments come and go. Nestle wants to be around in another 150 years. Believe us, they are very concerned about climate change in a big way. But they're locked in as well, is my view. They're locked in. They don't quite know how to get out and decentralize and deindustrialize and decarbonize all in the time space that we've all got. 20 years, probably less.
Does that apply to the big firms that do the big three, wheat, rice and maize?
Yeah, it does.
Like Cargill and so forth?
Yeah, it does. Well, it's 6 now, isn't it? 6 have the grain trade sewn up, 6 companies.
And following the question, they can be pressured to do something other than make money.
No, they are in business of making money, but they're making money through food. Food is a mechanism of power and control, and always has been. And it's a weapon of war, and we're being reminded that. I'm sorry to be sober, but I'm working on food defense at the moment. It's a very, very tough world out there in food. It's a very, very critical commodity. There's plenty of it there. In Europe, what is it we've got? David, you should know this. We've got 300,000 food manufacturing companies produce all the food of Europe, manufactured food. 1% of those have half the market. It's a fantastically concentrated food system. Yeah. And we've got to get real about that. That's Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy didn't talk about that corporate power. You know, is a Conservative government ever going to deal with it? Rightly. If I'd been Henry Dimbleby, I wouldn't have gone into that. But do we need to get a grip of that corporate power? Yes, we do.
Yeah, I think we've got 2 questions, so we'll take that. I'll take your question first and then come to you.
Hi, this is for everyone here. Hands up, who's a farmer?
You were a farmer, weren't you?
Yay! You look towards us as solutions, but I listen to some of your commentary and I think, wow, you guys are still in your ivory towers and not on the farm. I laugh at some of the comments and I can't remember them all, but basically, you need. There are lots of challenges being a farmer. We do lots of different jobs, not only food, but we are also increasingly pressurized to be the solution for environmental issues, primarily climate change, through various policies, as you've highlighted. Farming is a very slow business. Politics is quite fast, as we can see governments fall within a week. We cannot change. We have a rotation of 7 years on our farm. I don't know who else has other farms, how long their rotations are. We are very much focusing on, sorry, not really answering a question, but trying to answer your questions as a farmer. There's a lot of focus on the soil, regenerative farming, as you mentioned before, which is a way to kind of not so intensively use the land and not produce so much. we are getting lots of pressures from obviously environmental issues, but we're also being told to, there was a question whether we should actually grow food or save the climate through sequestration and carbon credits and things like that. So there's so much demand on a single acre of land here in the UK because we're so small anyway. But it's not only food. Food is no longer the priority for a farmer. It's becoming more like, let's plant the tree and save the environment. So when you say food security, it's also environmental security. And I think you sometimes forget that actually we're trying to do both things. And we don't get any support. All this technology, blah, blah, blah. The average age of a farmer is 55, maybe older. They're not going to be using the latest drone technology when they're probably going to want to retire in the next 10 years or something. That we are squeezed every which way, but I would say the farmers in the UK are the most diverse, most entrepreneurial. They survive year in, year out. And we have the ultimate challenge, which is weather, which you all forget about because that affects the soil, it sets all our resources. So just to throw it back at you, politics, the middlemen, yes, but fundamentally, we are doing the best we can. But we cannot give the answer to everything that you're posing all these issues to.
Thank you. David wants to...
No, I agree. And I hope it wasn't my comments that caused offence, because my background is farm extension. We're doing a lot of work at the moment on farmer mental well-being. And one of the drivers of why farmers feel under pressure is because all sorts of sections of society like to bash them, whether it's vegan activists or this and that. It's farmers responsible for climate change. Not everybody heating their homes or going on airplanes is the farmer's fault. Much an easier group to bash than other groups of society. So I attach no blame ever to the farmer. Farmers, many of whom will still be in the fields or just back from the fields, produce food, work incredibly hard to produce food for us that we eat 3 times a day. And they do what society tells them to do, what policymakers encourage them to do. Intensify production, that's what farmers will do, but they can get blamed for taking hedges out and all sorts of things. I don't attach blame to the farmer. I absolutely agree with what you say, every word of what you said, and that's why I tried in my opening speech to mention food producers, farmers watching. It is about trying to empower farmers to be the solution and not the problem. I think in this country we see it on the BBC all the time. We see it, I can get this one in, I've wanted to get this one in, kind of knee-jerk reactions from this university. Take meat off, all meat off the catering, bad idea. All of these knee-jerk reactions that paint farmers as the problem, but not the solution. 70% of this land in this country is farmed. Farmers are the solution for our food security challenges, our environmental challenges, and they just need a supportive environment. So I hope I didn't say anything that bashes them, but I recognise that the challenges you all face. I try and get out there as much as possible to see farmers. They're under huge pressure and they need help.
Thank you. Let's come back to you for what I think will be our last question.
I'll try and end it on a positive. Something, it's just a thought really, something that's been really useful for me over the years is thinking of food as medicine. So yes, it's a weapon of war, but it can also be a medicine. I think it's a really novel concept for me to think like that about food as not just calories and fuel, but actually a way to heal your body, heal your mind as well, and all the connotations that come with that. And I think if you optimize a food system for health, everything else follows rather than cost.
I think the problem with that is the idea of health has changed so wildly over the past century that, again, going back to the history, we did set it up because we thought this was healthy. We thought we needed huge quantities of meat, and that would fuel our workers to be the best workers on earth. So I agree on a certain level, but it's so fundamentally, I think the ideas of health are so diverse and moving in a very different way from where the food system is currently structured. So I think it's a very difficult, I'm sure other people who are more policy-oriented can speak to this, but I think it's a very... Yeah, so that is the issue. What do you mean by health? Is it nutrition science? Is it holistic health? Is it, you know...
Productionism was designed heavily by nutritionists and by, well, John Boydell was a doctor, a medical doctor, who basically created the prime research station on food and agriculture, and their argument was that the main health problem was lack of food, and we had to get more food, and even in the rich world, you know. And his reports made world news in the 1930s, and he became the DG of the FAO, the UN's post-Second World War Reconstruction Institute, on the basis of that argument. But Evelyn's quite right. You know, our understanding of diet and public health is different now. It's much more about diversity and range of nutrients. But I'm with you in terms of Boyd Orr would agree with you. He got the Nobel Prize for peace. There's no Nobel Prize for food, but he got it for peace on the grounds that he said, unless we're feeding people and feeding them for health, the world will always have political tensions that end up in war. And the reason I raised the issue of Ukraine is because we're seeing how very 19th century politics is with us again, and still always will be. Control of land, control of food as power.
Well, on those
It's
thoughts,
really, you know, if we want food for peace and for health, we have to see the politics of it, unfortunately.
yeah. Well, on those weighty thoughts, I'd like to wrap this up and thank our audience, both online and here, for asking great questions, and particularly thank our panel for stimulating what's been a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion. So thank you all very much. That was brilliant.
Good luck to his PhD. Much more important.
Thank you very much.